Coroners of Reddit, what is the strangest cause of death you've ever encountered? I did a summer internship at my state coroner's office as a way to pad my resume for medical school. There is one death that I will always remember, but not because it was especially disgusting. There was a male body brought in with 4 bullet holes in the anterior side, all of which were in the upper chest. Additionally, there were no exit holes on the posterior side and no evidence of bullet removal. However, after performing an autopsy for over an hour, the coroner could only find 2 bullets. After a lot more work, he ended up finding 1 bullet in the stomach and 1 in the small intestine. It turns out that these 2 bullets had actually punctured and entered the esophagus, and as he was dying his body swallowed and began to digest the 2 bullets. The coroner said he had actually seen this before, but that it was incredibly uncommon. That day I got a cool story and learned to never assume things at face value. I guess the saying eat lead was taken literally here. Not a coroner but a part-time forensic archaeologist. I mostly fly desk. Few years ago we excavated a mass grave of villagers killed summarily by the Nazis. Gruesome and sad, but pretty standard stuff. Piles of bones, clothes and personal items in a swamp of body pudding, sometimes known as cadaver goo. At the very edge of the pile we found another body, that of a 13-year-old girl, killed with a single shot to the forehead. A bit weird, since most of those executions were done through a shot to the back of the head. But the real question appeared after the body came back from the anthro lab. The girl died sometime between 1970 and 1980. Someone executed a teenager and buried her into a secret mass grave. Mortician here instead of coroner. But the weirdest case I had, without names, town, or anything being revealed, this person shot themselves with a 20-gauge shotgun to the head in their bedroom, lived through it, and managed to walk to the garage to reload a shell and finish the job. The way it went down, they shouldn't have made it past the first shell. We would have investigated it as a murder had the blood not shown a clear trail of what happened. It was a mess from the bedroom to the garage where the person had clearly shot themselves and walked in the garage to finish the job. Another case, when I went to pick up an elderly person in their home, the officer doing the house check found them standing at their kitchen sink dead from a heart attack. They died standing up and their skin was hanging from their arms holding onto the sink. It scared the officer shitless and he refused to re-enter the house lol. I've seen some weird crap in my time working for the ME, but if I found someone standing up dead at the kitchen sink, I'd run the frick out of there. For some reason, that is the one thing that freaks me out. Worst one I had was an elderly man had a 40-year-old son with the mental capacity of a small child. The old man died of natural causes and the 40-year-old son ended up dying of starvation or dehydration. He couldn't figure out how to make food. He had tried to eat a bag of flour. He was found on the ground next to his father playing with his toy cars. Saddest death I've experienced. I need a beer now. Oh wow, that's the saddest post I've seen. Poor kid. I take it there was no family or neighbors that would check in on them. Not a coroner but a cop at the time. September of 2015 I was on duty on my 3rd night working patrol after field training. This meant that I was patrolling in my own car without a training deputy with me. Being the new guy naturally I had the pleasure of working graveyard shift on weekends. Friday morn, 11 p7. Anyway, I was cruising one night and got a call for a signal 56. Possible 10-7. Accident with injuries. Possibly fatal. And naturally I raced to the scene with lights and sirens. I got to the scene and discovered a motorcycle rider laying face down in a pool of blood. He was riding on a road that has a 5-mile straightaway and was testing out the top speed on his R6. He ended up hitting a large rock doing about 130-140 miles per hour and it threw him off his bike. He ended up cartwheeling end over end. He was wearing full gear and a helmet but the force of the impact knocked his helmet off and when his head hit the pavement again it ripped the top of his skull open and the force of the cartwheel severed his brainstem and his entire brain was found laying on the road. I'll never forget that sight. People don't understand basic physics. If you are traveling at speed and your body suddenly slows down, everything else traveling at that speed tends to keep going at that speed. If your helmet is not very firmly attached, it simply continues on without you as you slow down. Tighten your chin strap, folks. I volunteered at a hospital where a psych patient killed himself by drowning himself in a bedpan he used to collect drips from the air conditioner and pee. I'm not a coroner, but I still had to help take him to the morgue. Not my own experience, but I remember a newspaper ran a 10 pages extra about suicide a few years ago in Europe. They went through archives and listed all the suicide methods used through the 20th century. There were no less than 3 suicides by power driller. All 3 of them in Germany. Go figure. In one of the cases, the guy had to drill 7 holes in his own skull before dying. Really wonder what was going through his head. Sounds like it was a drill going through his head. As a cop, I worked a scene where a dude was flayed to death. No weapon on scene, but defensive wounds on arms, hands, etc. Blood everywhere, the ceiling, walls, and all over this little one-room migrant workers' tar paper shack. We cleared the scene and left wondering WTF happened. The ME later told us the weapon used was a no-crap gym sock full of 1.5 inches drywall screws. About a half pound of spiky, angry metal in a fricking white athletic sock. Bloody heck, that's horrific. An electrician who committed suicide by some homemade device rigged to a CRT TV. Basically terminals rigged to a belt-type apparatus round his chest. Electrocuted instantly, but the current still flowed, so there was a pronounced cooking effect with some disintegration, both on site and once the remains reached us. No info on how the body was recovered safely. The worst thing was that his granddaughter found him when she let herself in to see him for lunch unexpectedly. A disproportionate number of autoerotic misadventures. No info on how the body was recovered safely. Probably turned off the power to the house, or even just unplugged the TV. I once responded to a shooting death in a car. Gang hit as he was stopped at a set of lights. As a firefighter, I don't go to a whole lot of murders, but I'd seen a few. There's normally a fair bit of blood. Not this time. This guy got shot about 5 or 6 times right in the middle of the chest. Every shot spot on, hitting the heart. His heart never beat after the first bullet, in all likelihood. There wasn't a single drop of blood in that car. Thought that was pretty weird. A friend of mine once did a summer internship at the city medical examiner's office, and she had to deal with this particular case. So this lady is walking her dog down the sidewalk once upon a time. The dog manages to get loose from its leash and bolts into the street, right underneath a stopped garbage truck. The lady, trying to save her pupper, ducks under the truck. At that moment, the garbage truck driver, oblivious to the what's happening, backs up and over the poor woman's head. As my friend described it, there was nothing left above the shoulders. The dog was fine, though. Note to self, wait until the truck moves, the dog will probably live. X worked at a funeral home. They had a customer, I guess, who committed suicide with a reciprocal saw, like a jigsaw, through her forehead. It was very clear that it wasn't easy, as she tried more than once before it was done. She said they had to turn the saw on to remove it. Determination to do something like that to oneself astonishes me. You'd think at some point something primal would stop you, like your body shutting down in an attempt to save itself. I had to call the coroner one night. One of our employees had to unload a barge load of drill pipe. I understand he was peeved being called out on a cold night, but that was part of the job. He didn't take the time to lower the outriggers. He lifted the pipe, swung it around, and when the crane started to tip over from the weight, he made his second mistake. He tried to jump off the crane. The top of the cab crushed his head like an eggshell. I got there before the EMTs. Within 20 minutes of the accident, his leg was still twitching. The coroner got there and he couldn't go anything because the body was pinned under the cab of the crane. Using jacks and shovels, we lifted the crane off of his body. I had the unenviable task of going to his home, waking up his wife to tell her what happened. He was late 50s, so at least there were no little children involved. Not a coroner, but I did recently come into my grandma's extensive genealogy of our C19 blood relatives in Texas. There were many weird stories, but this one seemed to stand out. I found another grave in Pidcoke Cemetery, Coyle County. That is interesting. There is only a metal marker. Lewis. Girl killed by Jack. Hers was the first grave in this cemetery. I remembered as a child Mama told me about this incident. Erna Mae Griffin told me the same story. They remember this child as being a niece of Laura Lewis and that she was always spoken of as baby. This was a very young child. She had wandered into the yard alone when the donkey attacked her. He would pick her up and toss her into the air, taking hunks of her body out with his teeth. When her mother was able to get to her, her body was scattered all over the yard. This depressed her mother so that the rest of her life was spent sitting by the window, grieving, and pulling her hair out. TLDR. Donkey rips toddler apart. Holy crap. I know a guy that was driving home from work with his coworker. They stopped at a drive-thru to buy hamburgers. My friend was riding as a passenger and he started eating his hamburger. The coworker that was driving ended up traveling around a curve too fast and rolled the truck. My friend had a mouthful of food and ended up choking to death on it. Otherwise than that, he did not suffer any injuries. The driver was fine. I will not eat and ride in a vehicle at all, fearing that I will die from choking on my food in accident. I won't use a straw in the car. A relative wrecked while their child was drinking from a straw. It pierced the back of her throat. A proctologist friend of mine told me he once had a guy brought in with an exploded colon. He went into a gas station, stuck the tip from that compressor people use to calibrate tires up his anus, and set to 50C. Boom. Why? The family that lived in the house before we moved in had a history of tragedy. The 14-year-old daughter killed herself on her parents' bed. She took an overdose. She'd written "help me" over and over on the wall in lipstick. Up in the loft she's written her name on the beams. Every time I go up to get something I see it and think of her. The mother got breast cancer a few months after her daughter died and the father was killed by an ambulance on the way to the hospital to visit his wife. She died shortly afterwards. The son, who is in his 50s now, is a severe alcoholic and it's only a matter of time for him. Such a sad series of events. It's like a modern day Book of Job. Not a coroner but in the emergency services. Went to a death once where the guy had suddenly dropped at the side of the road and his co-workers didn't know what had happened. He worked for a company cutting grass verges in our town and had a ride-on mower which was transported on the back of a trailer. The back of the trailer dropped down to form a ramp but was held under tension by a spring. It turned out the bolt holding the spring was rusted and on this occasion the tension of the ramp coming down had sheared off the bolt head and fired it at him with huge force from the sudden release. It hit him square on in the carotid artery. Didn't pierce the skin at all but ruptured it under the skin, causing him to die within seconds. Weirdest death I have ever been to. Poor guy was only in his 50s and had kids and a wife who waved him off to work that day. I was glad I didn't have to go and give them the death message. Wouldn't have known where to begin. If it had hit him anywhere else he would have had a big bruise and nothing more. There was a square inch or so of an area where it had the ability to be fatal and it got him. Final Destination type weirdness. Not a coroner, but this happened at a place I worked at previously. They were doing major renovations at the building I was working in, tearing out walls and creating a whole new space for some machinery we use. Part of the renovation demolition was to knock several new doors passageways in the old foundation to allow access from the new parts to the old. Each of these doors was 15 feet across by 12 high. The foundation was 3 to 4 feet thick. They accomplished this by drilling holes along the lines where the doors would be, spaced closely together. Then, using hand tools, they would break the wall down by sawzing it to crack between the holes, then falling inward. One of the workers on this crew was behind a section of wall they were drilling the final holes, when, due to an unforeseen weakness in the foundation, an entire piece broke away and fell down on him in one piece, crushing him completely. The piece, from estimates, weighed close to 5 tons. I didn't see it, but people in the area say he was completely flattened, with every bone in his body pulverized. TLDR. Construction worker squished like a grape underneath a cinder block. Obligatory not a coroner, but I have a book by Derek Hand, an Australian coroner, who discusses many famous and infamous cases. Some of the more bizarre deaths he investigated included a man who fancied himself as a Houdini, decided it would be a good idea to tie himself up and throw himself into the river to practice escaping. He wasn't a very good Houdini. A handyman who dug out some old gas heater and hooked it up. He and his wife died of carbon monoxide poisoning. A man who committed suicide by purchasing a bottle of sheep dip, walking out of the shop, and immediately drinking it. A woman who died of intestinal disorder. Turned out she had an ectopic pregnancy that had ruptured and led to massive blood loss and infection. Similarly, a man who had died in hospital from back pain. He actually had an undiagnosed spine fracture. Constant handling by the medical staff caused paraplegia and death from infection and septic shock. Spine fracture scares me since my neck spine has been hurting for about 2 years. 2 worst I had when I was a mortician's assistant at the age of 19 was a man cut down his arms and ripped the skin and tendons out of his arm, causing him to bleed out. I also had a man tie cement blocks, smaller ones, to his feet and push himself off the side of his pool in the deep end, causing him to drown. His family had went on vacation on Friday, which is the day he did it, and they came back Saturday of the next week to find him still in there. That was by far one of my worst pickups from the ME. Not me, but my girlfriend works with the Coroners service. Most interesting one she could think of was when a guy was scratching his leg and burst a varicose vein, which led him to bleed to death. I'm not a coroner, but through a rather odd series of events came into possession of the funeral records for my hometown. The records dated back over 100 years. The name, age, cause of death, and total cost of burial were on all of them. 2 causes of death were listed as kicked to death by mule, but the best simply said this woman who died in 1918 was crazy. Apparently the woman crazied herself to death. At the Mutter Museum of Medical Oddities in Philly, there's an entire wall of skulls listing as much info as possible, including gender, age, ethnicity, and how they died, if that info is possible to find at least. My favorite was the skull that just said tightrope walker. A buddy's dad owns a crime scene cleanup business. The 2 worst were, a guy decides to kill himself, so he takes his 20 gauge shotgun to the garage, puts it in his mouth and pulls the trigger, blows the side of his face all over the ceiling but is still alive and out of shells. He walks through the house up the stairs to his closet to get another round. The whole time he's spraying blood all over the place at a rate that it looked like it came from a fire hose. He gets to the closet and completes what he set out to do and sprays his brains all over the place. The other was a guy who decided to kill himself. He buys a brand new car that was $40,000 plus and takes a week-long road trip around the country. Ends up at his childhood home at a farm outside of Memphis, TN. It's the middle of August and it's 100 plus degrees. He hooks a hose up to his tailpipe and commits suicide. Nobody finds him for several days. By that time his corpse had literally exploded inside the car. The insurance company ran the numbers and decided it would be more cost effective to pay my buddy's dad $10K plus to clean up the car than it would be to total it out. He said there was 6 inches of pink fluid throughout the car. Some poor soul is driving that thing today. The dreaded pink slime. He probably thought he would save his family the cost of flying his remains home. Good intentions and all that. I worked for the medical examiner in my city for quite some time. The answer to this depends on your definition of the word strange. I autopsied a perfectly fit looking young man in his 20s once who died of a heart attack after someone played a prank on him. Turns out he had almost complete occlusion of the left anterior descending coronary artery, the Widowmaker, and was a smoker. This is sometimes a result of genetics that are not possible to predict. It was not a simple case of well-linked hypercholesterolemia. Healthy teenage female died suddenly after complaining of gastric pain. There were small hemorrhages all over the body. It was hemolytic uremic syndrome and the autopsy reeked of pee. Hemolytic uremic syndrome is basically a freak occurrence that happens after you get certain kinds of bacterial food poisoning. All of a sudden your blood cells get blown to bits, your kidneys fail, and your platelets get screwed up. It doesn't typically present this quickly. The case reports I read said it's a couple days of bloody diarrhea before it gets worse. The homicides are not as exciting as they sound. Almost always affair of hot blood. Person gets mad. Person commits murder. Typically with a gun. Welcome to America. The suicides are depressing as heck. And what I learned there is that suicide is almost always an impulse thing. If you can stop someone from taking his or her own life in that immediate moment, they probably won't try again. Being a divorced middle-aged man with a gun is a significant predictor. We did have one interesting homicide that involved a very old woman being pushed by her much younger mentally ill boyfriend. I'm talking like 40 years younger. The reason it was interesting is because he left her body where she fell 4 weeks and some animals carried off some of the bones. We had to wear spacesuits and walk around picking them up from various nooks and crannies at the crime scene. That was the most disgusting state of decomposition I ever saw our body in. It wasn't totally skeletonized or mummified or desiccated or anything, but the decay was so advanced that we couldn't make out any superficial details at all. I'll never forget that disgusting dark green grey color as long as I live, and I'm not easily disgusted after the experiences I had there. Dear Lord, note to self, don't do anything. We are all fricked. 2 kids from my neighborhood started jumping off of the overpass by our house onto trains. One day they jump but one of them lands on a car that has no roof and in it had a crushed mineral inside like a powder. So he went through a tarp that covered the car and disappeared in the car under the powdered mineral and suffocated trying to dig himself out. In Alberta we had a farming family lose 3 of their daughters because they fell into a grain truck. I think they emptied it but the girls had already suffocated. It led to the government finally instituting OHSA standards on farms. Obligatory, not a coroner, but I have a friend who is a paramedic who had to attend a suicide scene. The guy was a multi-millionaire. He laid down in the bottom of his elevator shaft and lowered the elevator onto him. My friend said it was like a pile of minced meat and a pool of blood. I shot a documentary about the LA County Coroner's Office. Among many stories, I was told by an investigator about a lone fisherman that met his maker on the California coastline. He was using his knife to cut line while still on shore, but was doing so with the blade cutting towards him. That is, he wasn't cutting away from his body. He accidentally sliced into his abdomen and was too far and isolated to get help. He died there sitting alone along the rocks, and if I recall correctly, a boy was first to notice the motionless man the next day, alerted others, and thusly the coroner. To this day, I remember the story whenever I handle a knife, envelope, package, tape, etc. Reading through this thread actually made me realize how lucky I am to be alive today. Ironically gives you a reason to leave the bed. I've posted this one before. My sister works as a histologist and has helped out for 1 or 2 autopsies. She told me a story of how when they were doing an autopsy on this guy his bowels were extremely swollen, hard and stuck together. On further examination, he had swallowed a fish bone which pierced his stomach into his intestines and skewered them together, leading to his death. Other stories she's told me about are a man and a woman who were driving along and got into a car accident at high speed. The husband was driving and wearing his seatbelt, while the wife was not. The husband's momentum against the seatbelt was enough to sever his upper body from the lower, killing him. The wife went through the windshield, skidded along the road for a bit and was mostly unharmed from the accident. An odd case of seatbelts not saving lives. Her boyfriend is now studying to be a pathologist. In my country they're the ones who carry out the autopsies, so I can ask him for weird autopsy stories if anyone is interested. Not a coroner but a paramedic. I have a few. First guy was riding a motorbike which slipped from under him on a downward slope sending him head first into a pavement pole decapitating him. Second was a little girl playing on her driveway who was bent down so that when her dad backed out to go to work he didn't see her and ran over her head. Third was not as graphic but very strange, a suicide for an ODP from the hospital who had committed suicide by overdose, but the way he did it was so eerie. He wore his best suit, self-cannulated about 5 times in each arm and connected himself up to a bunch of propranolol he'd been stealing from the hospital for about 2 weeks. When we came in he was sat upright in bed, super smartly dressed and his hands were still holding the tap for the last 2 drips. I have tons of these but I think these were the saddest weirdest. The second one nearly happened to me. My wife and kids were in the car. I said my goodbyes and started back to go into the house. Our new cat was in the driveway, behind the car. I bent down to pick up the cat. My wife slammed it in reverse and backed up, nailing me. She still claims it was an accident. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.